Hey Guy, welcome back to Sleep Among Titans, where we drift through strange and quiet corners of the past, perfect for listening before you sleep. Let the world you know fade away. We are drifting now over a vast city, sleeping under a fresh blanket of snow. It is quiet, the kind of profound quiet that only a winter's night can bring. But if you listen closely beneath the silence, you can hear a hum, a low, constant electrical hum. It is the sound of a great machine, a promise made of concrete and steel breathing in the cold. Our view drifts down past the wide, empty avenues, past the stoic faces of grand apartment blocks, and comes to rest on a single window glowing with a soft amber light. Behind that window, a different kind of life is unfolding with its own quiet rhythms. Tonight, we're not here to watch the grand movements of history. We are here to listen to the sound of a shared kitchen, to feel the patient cold of a queue for bread, and to taste the secret freedom of a small garden. Every city and every era has its own sound in the darkness. If this journey tonight brings you a sense of peace, leave a comment below and tell us. What does your city sound like as it falls asleep? But to understand the life lived behind that single glowing window, we must first understand the great promise that built its walls. A promise of a new world, and a reality lived in the close quarters of a shared hallway. That promise of a new world, it was written in stone and steel. For a child like Svetlana growing up in the 50s, the world felt enormous, designed for giants. The avenues in Moscow were wide enough to march an army down. And of course, sometimes they did. Buildings were like granite cliffs, their faces stern and serious, and always from a rooftop somewhere a giant red star was watching. Even the journey to work was meant to feel heroic. The metro stations were not stations. They were underground palaces, marble mosaics, chandeliers sparkling in the electric light, all meant to remind the worker of the paradise they were building. A rather grand thought to have on your way to assemble a tractor. But the paradise where it was actually lived did not smell of marble and victory. No, it smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. This was the world of the kommunalka, the communal apartment. A dozen families, sometimes more, sharing a single kitchen, a single telephone, and one long, dim hallway. A hallway that was a living museum of your neighbours' lives. Their sorrows, their secrets, their cooking. It all mingled in the air. Young Svetlana learned early that her life was not a solo performance. It was one small instrument in a crowded and often out-of-tune orchestra. And it was here, in this shared cramped space, that life developed its own quiet music. A rhythm of whispered arguments through paper-thin walls, a harmony of waiting your turn for the stove, a whole unspoken symphony of lives lived so very, very close together. So let us try to paint a picture of this music, the quiet symphony of the kommunalka. You must understand it was not merely a place, it was a universe unto itself. The apartment building was one of those grand, serious-faced structures, a monument to the collective. But inside that grand promise was divided and then divided again until it was compressed into single rooms. Svetlana's family, her mother, her father and herself had one such room. It was their bedroom, their living room, their dining room. It was their world. And down the long dim hallway behind other identical scuffed wooden doors lived other worlds, the Volkovs, the Orlovs and the formidable Petrova family. We will return to Mrs. Petrova and her aggressively fragrant cutlets later. They deserve a chapter of their own. The symphony began in that hallway. It was never truly silent. It was a museum of coats and boots, a forest of other people's lives. In winter, the air was thick with the scent of scratchy damp wool and the felt of Valenki boots, all slowly collectively drying. It was perpetually dim, lit by a single mournful low-wattage bulb that cast long, soft shadows, making the clutter a child's forgotten sled. A pair of skis leaning in a corner, a bicycle with a flat tire seemed like sleeping prehistoric animals. The floorboards themselves were a library of sounds. A young Svetlana learned to read their language. She could tell by the specific weary pattern of creaks that it was Mr. Volkov coming home late from the factory. A different lighter set of groans meant it was young Dmitry Orlov trying to sneak in after a date, his attempts at stealth making him, of course, the loudest of all. But the true heart of this universe, the bustling town square, was the kitchen. Ah, the kitchen. It was a masterpiece of unspoken treaties and delicate culinary diplomacy. With 4 families and only one 4-burner stove, a schedule was not a convenience. It was the fragile pillar of their civilization. Svetlana's mother had the stove from 5 o'clock until 6. Mrs. Petrova, who believed her borscht required a slow, theatrical simmer that could outlast a polar winter, claimed it from 6 until 7:30. This was a point of frequent, very quiet negotiation. A pot moved an inch to the side on the stove, a sigh let out with just a little too much force as someone waited. These were the subtle weapons of their small kitchen war. The air in there was a living history of the day's fortunes. It was a soup of smells. Svetlana's evening might be the simple, humble scent of potatoes and dill, but that aroma would be layered over the ghost of the Volkov's fried fish from lunchtime, and underneath it, all the eternal foundational scent of boiled cabbage from the day before. You knew what your neighbours were eating. You knew when they'd had a good day at the market, and you knew when they were making a single onion last for 3 nights. There were no secrets in the steam, and the walls of Svetlana's room were the thinnest membranes between worlds. They were not just walls, they were diaries read aloud whether you wished to or not. Svetlana learned the story of her neighbours through sound. She knew that the Orlov's new baby, little Katya, had a tooth coming in because her soft rhythmic crying was a gentle pulse in the quiet after dinner. She knew that Ivan, the student next door, was deeply at war with his violin. The same screeching, unhappy notes again and again for hours. Svetlana often thought the violin was losing, and sometimes the sounds were heavier. The low, angry rumble of a husband's voice from the Volkov's room followed not by a shout, but by a sharp, terrible silence, and then later the muffled sound of a wife's weeping. In those moments, a silent collective understanding would ripple through the apartment. Someone would turn up their radio just a little, not to drown out the sorrow, but to offer the gift of imagined privacy. They pretended not to hear, and the Volkovs pretended not to be heard. It was another of the unspoken rules. You learned everything and you acknowledged almost nothing. It sounds dreadful, doesn't it? A life with no privacy, no space to call your own, and in many ways it was. A constant low-grade exhaustion from always being among others. But there is a strange, resilient flower that can grow in such cramped soil. It is the flower of a reluctant but powerful shared humanity. Svetlana remembered being sick with a fever, a fire behind her eyes, and it was Mrs. Petrova the borscht, Queen, the kitchen rival who appeared at their door. She held a small bowl of hot chicken broth, the steam from it a silent flag of truce in their daily Cold War. She just put it in Svetlana's mother's hands, nodded once and left. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She remembered the night the single black telephone in the hallway rang for their family. It was a rare event, a sound that brought all the neighbours to their doorways suddenly needing to polish their shoes or check the mail, their ears tuned to the drama. The news was not good. Svetlana's grandmother in her distant village was unwell. When her mother returned to their room, her face pale with worry, she found a small, precious lump of sugar and 2 tea bags resting on their table. A gift from the Volkovs, who had almost nothing. They had heard, and they understood. That is the true rhythm of the communalka. A symphony of small annoyances, of clattering pots and screeching violins, but with a quiet, steady bass line of shared experience. An understanding that they were all in the same very crowded boat. But that shared experience, that quiet, patient understanding born of scarcity, it did not end at their apartment door. No. It found its most public and most patient expression out in the cold. Waiting. And so they would wait. In the world, you know, waiting is an inconvenience, a frustration, a problem to be solved with better systems, faster technology. For Svetlana and the millions like her, waiting was not an inconvenience. It was a condition of life. It was a social institution, a form of meditation, and sometimes a very slow, very cold outdoor theatre. A queue did not begin with an official announcement. That would have been far too simple, too organised. It began with a whisper, a rumour, a ghost of a story that would flit down the long dim hallway of the communalka. Someone's cousin who worked near a warehouse had seen a truck. A green truck. A green truck usually meant something interesting had been delivered. Not just potatoes, maybe Hungarian boots. Or perhaps, if the universe was feeling truly generous, a crate of oranges from Morocco. That whisper was all it took. A quiet, collective stirring would begin. Coats would be put on, and most importantly, the avoska would be retrieved from its hook. It was a simple string bag, but it was a national symbol of profound optimism. The name itself came from the Russian word for just in case, or on the off chance. You carried it everywhere, avoska, something wonderful and unexpected might appear. That little bag of string folded up in a pocket held more genuine hope than all the 5-year plans combined. Then the migration. Svetlana would watch her mother join the quiet, determined stream of women heading out into the cold. You would find the end of the line a long winding serpent of grey and brown coats already stretching down the street, and you would take your place in it, and then you would wait. In the winter, this was a true art form. The cold was a physical thing, a creature that gnawed at your bones. They would stand for hours, stamping their feet in a slow, shuffling, unchoreographed dance to keep the blood moving. Svetlana could see her own breath, a small fleeting cloud of her own life, joining the hundreds of other small clouds rising into the frozen air. There was a hard beauty to it, the world silent and white, under a blanket of snow, the sharp, clean scent of frost. But it was a beauty you felt in your aching toes. And yet there was a strange warmth in that shared misery. You would begin to talk to the person in front of you, the person behind you. Strangers became temporary family bound by a common goal and a shared enemy, the slow, merciless ticking of time. The Q was the city's true newspaper. It was where you learned the real news, not the heroic nonsense they printed in Pravda. You learned which store might have eggs tomorrow, who had a cousin who could get you tickets to the ballet, and that Mrs. Petrova from Svetlana's building had somehow acquired a new hat, which was of course a scandal of the highest order. The Q was a stage, and it had its regular cast of characters. There was always one person, usually an old man, who would complain about everything. The cold, the government, the quality of the bread last week, the disrespect of the youth. They were the official grumbler. Every Q had one, and everyone listened to him with a kind of fond annoyance. His complaints were a predictable part of the scenery. There was also the eternal optimist, a woman who was absolutely convinced that today was the day they were selling French perfume. It was never French perfume, but her hope was a small flickering candle in the grey cold, and there were rules, a powerful unwritten constitution. If Svetlana's mother had to run home to check on the soup, she would ask the woman behind her to save her spot. It was a sacred trust. That woman would guard the empty space with the ferocity of a Kremlin guard. To jump the queue was the greatest of social sins. It would be met with a wall of cold, silent, unified disapproval that was more powerful than any police force. For very long queues, someone would take a piece of chalk or a chemical pencil and write a number on the back of your hand. You were number 147. You were now part of a system. You could go warm up for an hour in a nearby doorway and return to claim your rightful place. It was a self-governing, frozen little republic. Sometimes you didn't even know what you were waiting for. You saw a long line and you simply joined it. The logic was undeniable. If so many people were willing to suffer for it, it must be something worth having. It was a gamble. You might wait for 3 hours and find you are now the proud owner of a single slightly bruised cabbage. A disappointment, yes, but at least it was something. But other times it was magic. Svetlana remembered her mother coming home once, her face flushed with cold and triumph. She had waited for hours, the rumour being only of footwear, and at the end she had bought a pair of soft leather boots from Czechoslovakia. Not the stiff, ugly things they usually wore. They were elegant, beautiful. She kept them in their box for a month, taking them out at night just to look at them. And the best of all was the bread. The queue for bread had a different feeling, a more fundamental, more serious energy. And the reward was not just an object, it was a smell. The smell of the hot, fresh bread filling the cold air as you walked home. Svetlana's mother would tear off a small piece of the crust, the gorbushka, while it was still warm. The steam would hit her face, and that taste of victory, of patience rewarded, of simple, life-giving warmth. Ah, for that you would wait a lifetime. The queue taught patience, yes, but it taught something deeper. It was a great leveller. The university professor, with his head full of philosophy, stood in the same line for the same loaf of bread as the street sweeper. In the queue all were equal. All were simply waiting. But even as they waited for a truck to deliver their daily bread, they dreamed. They dreamed of a place where they didn't have to wait. A place where the food didn't come from a state warehouse, but from the rich dark earth itself. A place of abundance of freedom where your time was finally your own. And sometimes in the brief, glorious summer they were allowed to go there. They were allowed to escape to a small patch of personal paradise they called the Dasha. The dream of the Dasha. It was the counterpoint to the long, cold wait of the queue. If the queue was the city's prose, a story of patience and necessity, the Dasha was its poetry. A short, beautiful verse written in sunlight and soil. The escape began on a Friday afternoon with a journey on the Električka, the electric train. The train was a world of its own. It would be packed with families, a cheerful, noisy migration leaving the grey city behind. The air inside was a warm human mixture of sweat-boiled eggs and damp coats, but no one seemed to mind. The windows would be open, and as the train rattled and swayed, the endless walls of concrete would slowly, miraculously give way to the first glimpses of green. Then suddenly you were flying through them, endless forests of birch trees, their white trunks flashing past like the pages of a book being riffled. Svetlana would press her face against the cool glass, watching the city and its rules, its hum, its anxieties all recede until they were just a memory. Their dacha, like most, was not a grand country estate. It was a small wooden house built by her father's own hands, with a slightly crooked porch and a roof that sang a loud metallic song when it rained. It was a place of glorious imperfection. The moment they arrived, the first act was always the same: to breathe. To take a long, deep breath of air that didn't smell of coal smoke and crowded hallways, but of pine needles, damp earth, and the wild, sweet scent of distant meadows. The silence here was different too. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was full of its own sounds: the buzz of a bumblebee, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a cuckoo. And the heart of this small kingdom was the garden. It was a tiny plot of land no bigger than a city room, but in it a revolution took place every summer. This was not a hobby. This was a second, more important economy. It was a source of survival and a source of immense pride. Svetlana's father, a quiet man at home, became a philosopher king in his garden. He would inspect his tomato plants with the gravity of a general reviewing his troops. He would wage a relentless personal war against weeds. He had theories about soil, about sunlight, about the moral character of a particular cucumber. Svetlana would work alongside her mother, her small hands in the rich, dark soil. The work was hard, weeding, watering, digging for potatoes, but it felt different from the tired grey work of the city. This was work that fed you body and soul. She learned the feel of the world through her fingertips, the fuzzy, fragrant leaves of a tomato plant, the surprising strength of a carrot being pulled from the earth, the delicate architecture of a dill flower, and the abundance. After the city, where a handful of onions was a successful hunt, the dacha was a land of unbelievable riches. Bright red jewels of strawberries still warm from the sun, which never made it into the basket, but went straight from the plant to her mouth, their sweetness an explosion of pure, uncomplicated joy. The sharp, clean scent of blackcurrant leaves crushed between her fingers. The first tiny cucumber of the season, picked and eaten right there, its watery crunch, the very taste of summer. This was food that had no price. It was not something you waited for. It was a gift you helped to create. The days there had their own gentle rhythm. In the late afternoon, her father would fire up the old samovar, the water heater, using a handful of dry pine cones for fuel. The smoke that curled into the blue sky smelled of the forest itself. They would sit on the crooked porch, drinking hot sweet tea from glass cups and eating bread with wild strawberry jam her mother had made the year before. This was a quiet, sacred ritual, a time for talk that felt easier, more open, than the whispered conversations in the kitchen of the kommunalka. Here there were no neighbours listening through the walls. The only audience was the birch trees, and they were very good at keeping secrets. Sometimes they would all walk down to the small cold river at the edge of the forest. The shock of the icy water was a kind of baptism, washing away the dust and weariness of the city. Svetlana would float on her back, looking up at the vast empty sky, feeling a sense of freedom so total, so profound, it was almost overwhelming. And when it rained, the sound of the fat summer drops drumming on the tin roof of their little house was the most peaceful music in the world, a private cosy percussion that made the world outside disappear, leaving only the safety of their small wooden haven. This was what the dacha truly was. It was an escape, a temporary precious release from the hum of the state, from the gaze of the collective. It was a place where a family could simply be a family. On Sunday evening they would board the Električka again, their bags heavy with potatoes, carrots and jars of pickles, their skin smelling of sun and wood smoke. As the train rattled back toward the city, Svetlana would watch the birch forest thin out, and the familiar grey buildings rise up to meet them. The feeling of the concrete walls closing in again was always a small, quiet sadness. That freedom of the dacha was a private, personal thing, a story written in the earth. But back in the city, another world, another story was waiting for Svetlana and the children of her generation. A story that was not private but public, not personal but collective, A world painted in a very different colour. A bright, proud and unavoidable colour. The colour of a pioneer's scarf. That freedom of the Dhaka was a private personal story, a secret whispered between the family and the soil. But back in the city, another world, another story was waiting for Svetlana and the children of her generation. A story that was not private but public, not personal but collective. A world painted in a very different colour, a bright, proud and unavoidable colour, the colour of a pioneer's scarf. For a Soviet child, life was measured in milestones, and none was more anticipated, more revered than the day you became a young pioneer. Svetlana, at 9 years old, had watched the older children in her schoolyard for years. They seemed like a different species, elevated and important, marked by the flash of red at their necks. They walked with a certain straightness to their backs. They were no longer just children, they were part of the great project, and she waited for her turn with a deep, consuming ache of anticipation. She and her classmates spent weeks preparing. They memorized the pioneer's solemn promise, the words feeling heavy and important on their tongues. A young pioneer of the Soviet Union, in the presence of my comrades, solemnly promised to be true to the cause of the working class and to the precepts of Vladimir Lenin. To a child, these were not political words. They were a vow like those of a knight in an old story, a promise to be good, to be brave, to be helpful. And then the day came. The ceremony was held in the school's grand assembly hall. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish and nervous excitement. The children stood in neat, silent rows, their hearts thumping a fast, frantic rhythm against their ribs. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like tiny golden sparks. One by one, their names were called. When Svetlana heard hers, she walked forward, her legs feeling stiff and unfamiliar. An older pioneer, a serious-faced girl of 14, stood before her. She held the scarf, a perfect triangle of red silk. And then came the ritual, a movement practiced and repeated 1,000,000 times in schools across the land. The older girl draped the scarf around Svetlana's neck, crossed the two ends over her chest, and with a series of quick, expert folds tied the square knot. The knot was important. It was meant to be a symbol of the unbreakable bond between the 3 generations of communism, the pioneers, the Komsomol youth, and the party members. For Svetlana, it was simply the most important knot in the world. She felt the slippery, cool silk against her skin. It was done. She was a pioneer. A wave of pride so powerful it felt like a physical warmth washed over her. She turned to face her comrades, and together they all raised their right hands in the pioneer salute, a gesture of readiness their small hands held, just above their foreheads, as if shielding their eyes to see the bright future more clearly. In that moment in that hall, they were a single entity, a small, dedicated army of children ready to build a better world. That red scarf became a sacred object. It was a piece of the great red banner of the revolution, they were told, and it had to be treated with the utmost respect. Svetlana's mother taught her how to wash it by hand carefully, and how to iron it, pressing it under a damp cloth until it was perfectly smooth, its corners sharp and precise. To appear at school with a wrinkled scarf was a small, quiet shame. It was a sign that you did not care, that you did not understand the weight of the promise you had made. Life as a pioneer was a life of missions and collective adventures. They were small, of course, but felt monumental at the time. There were the scrap metal drives where entire schools would compete to see who could collect the most discarded metal for the nation's great factories. Svetlana and her friends would spend weeks scouring back alleys and asking neighbours for any old unwanted pots or machine parts, hauling their treasures back to the schoolyard like triumphant explorers. There were the waste paper collections, the same idea but with old newspapers and magazines. These were not chores. They were campaigns, part of a great important war against wastefulness. And in the summer, there was Pinalega Pioneer Camp. For 3 weeks they lived in the forest, sleeping in simple wooden barracks, singing songs around a giant campfire every night. They learned about nature, they played games, and they listened to stories of heroes, not of mythical knights, but of young revolutionary heroes, of brave partisans who had fought in the Great Patriotic War. They were taught that they too could be heroes. The state, for all its grey sternness, invested in its children. In the city there were the pioneer palaces. To a child like Svetlana, who lived in a single crowded room, these buildings were almost magical. They truly were palaces, vast opulent buildings with marble floors, grand staircases and endless corridors. And everything inside was for them, and it was all free. There were clubs for every possible interest. A quiet, serious boy could join the chess club and be taught by a grandmaster. A girl who dreamed of the sky could join a model airplane club. There were rooms for ballet, for painting, for engineering, for folk dancing. It was a world of possibility, a beautiful shining idea that the future belonged to the children, and the state would give them every tool they needed to build it. It was a beautiful idea, a world built just for children, and it was also, of course, a world built to create a very specific kind of adult. Svetlana learned the stories of heroes like Pavlik Morozov, the famous boy pioneer who, as the legend went, had denounced his own father to the authorities for hoarding grain, and was later killed by his own family. The story was told as an example of ultimate loyalty to the state. For Svetlana, it was a confusing story. It felt wrong. To betray your own father. It was a small, unsettling note in the otherwise bright and heroic music of her pioneer life. A quiet question that she learned very quickly not to ask out loud. So she embraced the rest of it. The pride, the belonging, the sense of purpose. She wore her red scarf until its colour began to fade and its edges began to fray. She was a good pioneer. She sang the songs the state had taught her, her clear young voice joining the chorus of millions, all singing of the bright road to communism. But late at night, in the quiet of their single room, when the city outside was asleep and the only sound was the familiar ticking of the clock, her father would sometimes teach her another kind of song. A quieter, more complicated and far more dangerous song, one that was not meant for a chorus but was whispered in secret from forbidden pages. The songs of the pioneers were sung under the wide-open sky, in the bright sunlight of summer camps and the grand echoing halls of the school. They were songs for a chorus of millions, simple, proud and loud. But the most powerful songs, the ones that truly shaped the landscape of the soul, were sung in a whisper. They were sung late at night in the quiet of a single room when the rest of the great collective machine had finally gone to sleep. Imagine the scene. It is a winter's night in the Kommunalka. The hallway outside has fallen silent. The only sounds are the distant moan of the wind and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Svetlana's mother, already asleep in her bed on the other side of the room. A young Svetlana lies in her own small cot pretending to be asleep, her eyes closed to narrow slits. A single low-wattage lamp on the small table casts a warm, lonely pool of light, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. Her father comes home late. His footsteps are quiet, not the tired, heavy tread of a factory worker, but the careful, deliberate steps of a man carrying a secret. He does not bring a bag of groceries or a bottle of vodka. He brings something far more precious and far more dangerous. From the deep inner pocket of his coat, he pulls a small, soft bundle wrapped in a plain cloth. Svetlana watches through her lashes as he unwraps it. It is not a book, as you would know it. It is not bound in leather or printed on fine, crisp paper. This is samizdat, self-published. It is a thin stack of pages typed on the thinnest, most fragile onion skin paper, so transparent you can almost see the words on the next page through it. The letters are a faint, slightly uneven grey struck by the keys of a manual typewriter, and the pages are held together by a simple, hand-sewn piece of string. This object is not a product of a factory. It is an act of faith, an act of rebellion so quiet it is almost invisible. Her father gently wakes her mother. They don't speak. A look passes between them, an understanding of the ritual that is about to begin. They huddle close together by the lamp, their heads almost touching, creating a small tent of intimacy in the quiet room. And then her father begins to read. His voice is a low murmur, a current of sound so soft it would not travel through the thin plaster walls. He is reading poetry. The poems of Anna Akhmatova, or perhaps Osip Mandelstam. Names that were never mentioned at school. Names that did not exist in the bright, simple world of the pioneers. Svetlana, pretending to sleep, does not understand all the words. The poems are not about building tractors or exceeding production quotas. They are about other things. About the way the moonlight falls on the Neva River. About the heartbreak of a final goodbye at a train station. About the weight of memory and the resilience of a single human soul against the crushing ice of history. The words are complicated, full of shadows and sorrows, and a beauty so sharp it almost hurts. What she understands is not the meaning, but the feeling. She understands the reverence in her father's voice, the way he handles the fragile pages as if they were the wings of a butterfly. She sees the single tear that traces a path down her mother's cheek, catching the lamplight like a tiny diamond. She knows with the deep, certain instinct of a child that this is important. This is a truth that is different from the loud, cheerful truths of the day. This is a truth that can only be spoken at night in a whisper. The air in the room is thick with the power of these forbidden words. It is also thick with fear. The narrator's voice becomes a near whisper. An object like this, a few pages of poetry, could be classified as anti-Soviet agitation. The penalty for possessing it, for sharing it, was not a scolding from a teacher. It was a visit from men in long coats, a journey to a place from which people did not often return. A single loud knock on the door would be the end of their small, quiet world. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside is a potential threat. Every distant shout in the street below makes their shoulders tense. When her father finishes the last poem, a profound silence fills the room. It is a silence full of the words that have just been spoken and the unspoken danger they all feel. Her father does not put the book on a shelf. He carefully wraps it in its cloth once more. Then he kneels, and with a small knife he pries up a single loose floorboard near the wall. He places the small bundle in the dark, dusty space beneath, alongside a few other similar treasures. He gently presses the floorboard back into place. The secret is safe, once more hidden in the very foundation of their small life. Svetlana lies in her cot, the rhythm of the poem still echoing in her mind. This is her other education. By day at school, she learns the simple, bright mathematics of the collective. 100 pioneers are stronger than one. 1,000 tons of steel are better than 500. By night in her room, she learns the complicated, shadowy grammar of the human heart. She learns that a single word can hold more weight than a ton of steel. She learns that sadness can be beautiful, and she learns that some things are so precious they must be hidden from the light. It was an education in the weight of words and in the existence of two separate worlds. There was the official world, a grand stage where everyone played their part. And then there was the real world, which lived in the spaces between the floorboards, in the quiet of the kitchen, and in the secret gardens of the dacha. These secret worlds, the dacha, the hidden book, were small islands of truth in a vast ocean of official stories, and connecting them all, stitching together the immense sprawling map of the motherland with its grand cities and its tiny forgotten villages was the steady rhythmic heartbeat of the train. These secret worlds, the dacha, the hidden book, they were small islands of truth in a vast ocean of official stories, and connecting them all, stitching together the immense sprawling map of the motherland with its grand cities and its tiny forgotten villages was the steady rhythmic heartbeat of the train, the poezd. To travel across the Soviet Union was to understand the true meaning of distance of space, and the long-distance train was the vessel for this understanding. Let us join Svetlana, now a young woman, as she stands on the platform of a Grand Moscow station. The air is thick with the sharp metallic scent of coal smoke, and the hiss of steam from the great black engine. It feels alive, a sleeping iron beast about to begin its long journey east. The platform is a river of humanity, soldiers in dull green uniforms returning to their posts, students with battered suitcases, families beginning their summer migration to see relatives thousands of kilometers away. She finds her carriage, the Platzkart, a long open car that is less a means of transport and more a rolling temporary village. She finds her bunk, a simple hard berth, and stows her small bag. The train gives a great shuddering lurch, a groan of steel, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the station begins to slide away. The journey has begun. The first hours are a slow unwrapping of the city. The grand buildings give way to sprawling factory yards, then to endless blocks of concrete apartments, and finally to the small wooden houses at the city's edge. And then the city is gone, and there is only the land. The rhythm asserts itself. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. It is the country's true lullaby, a sound that has rocked generations of travellers to sleep. Svetlana watches out the window as the world transforms into a moving tapestry. Endless forests of birch trees, their white trunks like silent watching sentinels. Vast open fields of wheat rippling like a golden sea under the immense empty sky. Tiny villages flash past a brief fleeting glimpse of a wooden house, a wisp of smoke from a chimney, a solitary figure watching the train go by, and then they are gone, swallowed again by the forest. Life inside the carriage settles into its own gentle routine. The first most important ritual is tea. At the end of each car, a great silver samovar gurgles and steams, a permanent fountain of boiling water, the kipyatok. It is presided over by the provodnica, the carriage attendant, a formidable woman who is the undisputed queen of this moving kingdom. For a few kopecks, she provides a glass resting in a beautiful ornate metal holder, the podstakanik that keeps your fingers from burning. Svetlana joins the quiet queue at the samovar, and soon she's back in her seat, holding the hot glass, the steam warming her face, watching the endless green blur of the taiga forest outside. Soon the smells of dinner begin to fill the air. There is no dining car in the Platzkart. Each traveller brings their own provisions, and soon the small tables are covered with humble feasts. The sharp, comforting scent of dark rye bread, the clean, salty smell of hard-boiled eggs and pickles, the rich, fatty aroma of sausage, and always food is shared. The soldier across the aisle offers Svetlana a piece of his smoked fish. Her neighbour, an old woman with eyes as kind and wrinkled as a baked apple, insists she try one of her homemade proshki small pies filled with cabbage. On the train for a few days, the rules of the city fall away. Strangers are no longer strangers. They are fellow travellers, temporary neighbours in this long-rolling house. As evening falls, the lights in the carriage are dimmed. The conversation soften to murmurs. Svetlana's neighbour begins to tell her life story, a quiet, rambling tale of war, of love, of children grown and gone. The train is a great confessional on wheels. The constant motion, the shared anonymity, it unloosens tongues and allows secrets to be shared with a stranger you will never see again. Svetlana listens, the woman's soft voice blending with the steady, hypnotic clatter of the wheels. Da-dum-da-dum, da-dum-da-dum. Night falls. The window becomes a black mirror reflecting the dim lights of the carriage. But out in the deep, dark countryside, the sky is a velvet cloth, strewn with a million sharp, brilliant stars. There are no city lights to dim their fire. It is a sky of profound, intimidating beauty, a reminder of the vast, wild emptiness the train is cutting through. Svetlana lies in her bunk wrapped in the rough, clean linen provided by the provodnica, and lets the gentle swaying motion of the train and the relentless rhythm of the wheels rock her into a deep and dreamless sleep. Sometimes the train will stop, in the middle of the night at a small forgotten station whose name is just a single, peeling sign on a wooden platform. The train will sigh to a halt, and for a few minutes the hypnotic clatter is replaced by an intense ringing silence. A rush of cold, pine-scented air fills the carriage. On the platform, a few old women babushki might be standing holding up jars of pickles, or a basket of hot-boiled potatoes, their faces briefly illuminated in the train's lights, before the train groans back into motion, leaving them and their small, lonely station behind in the vast, sleeping dark. The journey is a state of suspension. You're neither where you began nor where you are going. You are simply in transit. It is a time for reading, for thinking, for doing nothing at all but watching the world pass by. It is a long, slow, meditative breath. But no journey lasts forever. After 2 days, the landscape begins to change again. The endless forests begin to thin. The first signs of industry appear on the horizon, a tall smokestack, a sprawling factory complex. The gentle, natural rhythm of the journey is coming to an end. The train slows its long, mournful whistle, echoing over the outskirts of a new city. The lullaby of the rails was fading. Svetlana gathers her things, the dreamlike state of the journey dissolving as the hard reality of her destination approaches. She was arriving ready to begin a new chapter. And the music of her new life was waiting. A harder, louder, more demanding rhythm. The great metallic symphony of the factory. The lullaby of the rails had faded its gentle, wandering rhythm, giving way to the hard-edged grid of a new city. Svetlana, now a young woman, had arrived at her destination, and the music of her new life was waiting. It was a harder, louder, more demanding rhythm, the great metallic symphony of the factory. The factory was not just a building, it was a city within a city. It had its own great gates, its own smokestack towers that were the new cathedrals breathing grey clouds into the sky. Every morning a great river of people flowed through its gates, Svetlana among them, their individual footsteps lost in a collective shuffle, and as you drew closer the sound began, a low foundational hum that you felt in the soles of your feet, in the fillings of your teeth before you even truly heard it. It was the sound of the factory breathing. Svetlana worked at the Red Star Textile Combine. To step inside the main weaving hall was to step into the heart of a mechanical storm. The sound was overwhelming, a physical presence that pushed against you. It was a roar, a deafening, all-consuming chaos of 1,000 different noises. But if you stayed within it day after day as she did, the chaos began to resolve itself. The roar became a rhythm. The noise became a symphony. There was the deep, steady bass note, the powerful hum of the main drive belts, long rivers of black leather high overhead, turning the great wheels that gave life to the entire hall. Beneath that, the percussion section, the sharp, relentless, hypnotic clack, clack, clack of 1,000 wooden shuttles flying back and forth across the looms with impossible speed, weaving the threads into a solid sheet of new cloth, and woven through it all the high whistling melody of the spindles, the soft whirring of the bobbins, a million tiny parts, all moving in perfect, frantic harmony. The clatter and the hum and the clatter. It was a deafening lullaby, and for 8 hours a day it was the only music in the world. Svetlana stood at her station presiding over 2 of these noisy, complicated beasts. In her first weeks, the loom had seemed like an angry alien creature, all sharp angles and sudden jarring movements. But over time, she had learned its language. She knew by the specific pitch of its clatter if a thread was about to break. She knew by the vibration under her feet if the tension was wrong. The machine was her partner, a demanding, tireless, and exceedingly loud partner. Her movements became part of the music. She would sway almost unconsciously in time with the rhythm of her machines. Her hands, nimble and sure, would dart in to tie a broken thread with a knot so quick it was just a blur of motion. It was a dance between human and machine, a choreography learned through endless repetition until it was no longer a thought but an instinct. In this state, the mind could drift. The noise was so total, so absolute, that it created a strange kind of inner silence. You couldn't think over the roar, so you learned to think under it. Her body would perform its duties, and her mind would be free to wander, to remember a line from a hidden poem, to think of the taste of wild strawberries at the dacha, to simply float in the great roaring river of sound. The air itself had its own character. It was thick with the sharp, clean scent of machine oil, the smell of hot metal, and the soft, fuzzy, ever-present dust of cotton fibres that would catch in the shafts of sunlight slanting down from the high, dirty windows. The sight of the hall was as mesmerizing as its sound. Rows upon rows of identical looms stretched into the hazy distance, a mechanical forest of iron and steel. The shuttles were a blur of motion, and at the end of each machine a perfect, clean, unbroken river of white fabric slowly spooled onto a great roller, a silent testament to all this noise and chaos. And the floor. The floor was alive. A constant, steady vibration pulsed up through the thick concrete, a tremor from the thousands of moving parts. It was a feeling you became accustomed to, a low-level earthquake that lasted the entire shift. And when Svetlana left the factory at the end of the day, she carried it with her. For hours afterwards, sitting in the quiet of her small apartment, she could still feel that phantom vibration humming in her bones. The factory never truly let you go. But it was not a lonely place. The noise made conversation impossible, but the workers had their own silent language. A nod across the aisle, a quick hand gesture to signal a problem, a shared, knowing roll of the eyes when a supervisor walked by. It was a community forged in noise, a team whose members rarely spoke to one another. The only real quiet came during the lunch break. A bell would ring, a sound that barely cut through the din, and the great machines would slowly, reluctantly shudder to a halt. The silence that followed was shocking, a physical void that left your ears ringing. In that sudden, blessed quiet, the women would gather in the canteen, sharing simple meals of bread and soup. Their conversations quick and animated, making up for the long silent hours. They would talk of their children, of the cues of a new film showing in the city. And they would look at the posters on the wall, the smiling heroic faces of Stakhanovites, the heroes of socialist labour, who had exceeded their quotas, their chests covered in medals. And they would feel a quiet, weary pride. They were building the future. They were clothing the nation. This noise, this exhaustion, it had a purpose. But the purpose came at a cost. The narrator reflects. To be a part of this great symphony was to feel a sense of power, of contribution. But it was also to know in the deepest part of your being that you were just one small replaceable part in a vast impersonal machine. The loom could be fixed, the thread could be replaced, and so could you. The music was magnificent, but it did not care for the individual musician. At the end of the day, the final bell would ring. The great river of people would flow back out through the factory gates, their faces grey with fatigue, their ears still ringing with the echo of the machines. Svetlana would walk home through the darkening streets, the phantom hum still vibrating in her body, a ghost of the day's labour. The noise of the factory was honest. It was loud, it was relentless, and it never pretended to be anything other than what it was. But at home in the quiet of the evening, as she sat with her family in their small kitchen, a different kind of communication was needed. A language not of roaring machines, but of whispers, of careful silences, of things left unsaid, a language spoken only at the kitchen table. The factory was honest in its noise. Its great roaring symphony was a public declaration of purpose, a sound that filled the sky. But the truth of a family, the delicate, fragile truth of a life, lived within the state. That was a much quieter thing. It was a truth spoken only in a whisper, in the one place that felt for a few hours each night like a sanctuary, the kitchen. For Svetlana and her husband Nikolai, their small kitchen was more than a place for cooking. In a life lived in a communalka, where the walls had ears and the hallway was a public square, the kitchen with its door closed became the inner sanctum. It was their unofficial parliament, their strategy room and their confessional. It was the only room in their universe where they could attempt to be themselves. The ritual would begin after their own children were asleep, their soft breathing a steady rhythm from the next room. The first step was not to speak, but to create a shield. Nikolai would turn on the small bakelite radio, keeping the volume low. It was not for the music, a forgettable melody from a state orchestra. It was for the static. The soft, gentle hiss was a curtain of sound, a fragile barrier against the listening ear of a neighbour, against the very plaster of the walls. Then Svetlana would pour the tea. Not the strong, fragrant tea of a special occasion, but the weak daily brew sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. They would sit opposite each other at the small table covered with a worn oilcloth tablecloth, printed with a faded pattern of blue flowers. And in the warm, small circle of light from the single bulb hanging overhead, they would begin to talk. But it was not a conversation as you might know it. It was a different language altogether. A language of pauses, of half-finished sentences, of a grammar built from glances and the smallest shifts in tone. They spoke in code not because they were spies, but because they were ordinary people who had learned that words were heavy, dangerous things. The narrator explains they would not speak of politics directly, never. Instead, they spoke of people, of the small human ripples that spread from the great unseen stones dropped by the state. Nikolai might stir his tea, the clinking of his spoon against the glass, the only sharp sound in the room. He would not say, "I think our friend Victor from the ministry was betrayed by his deputy." He would stare into his glass and say, "It is a strange time for Victor to receive such a promotion." And Svetlana, watching the way he did not meet her eyes, would understand the universe of meaning packed into that single carefully chosen word, strange. She would understand that Victor was in danger, that his promotion was a trap, and that the man who had betrayed him was now closer to them than ever before. She in turn might speak of a new teacher at the children's school. She would not say this woman is a zealous informant who watches everything we do. She would say, the new teacher is very correct. She has a great passion for the rules. And Nikolai would know to caution their son to be careful, to not ask too many questions, to be a grey, unremarkable student in her class. This was the art of the kitchen table conversation, to paint a detailed picture of the world using only the palest, most transparent colours. It was a constant, exhausting act of translation. Every word had a shadow, every silence had a weight. The most important things were what was not said, the pause before an answer. The subject quickly changed, the shared knowing look that said, "We will not speak of this any further." The fear that created this language was not always of a midnight knock on the door from a man in a long leather coat. It was a quieter, more intimate fear. It was the fear of the neighbour's ear against the wall, the fear of a casual remark overheard in the shared hallway being repeated to a block warden, perhaps with a slight malicious twist. A remark made out of frustration or weariness could be retold as dissent as a political crime. It was a world where envy or a petty grudge could become a weapon. And so the kitchen became the only place of trust. Here they could allow their public faces the masks of cheerful, compliant Soviet citizens they wore all day to relax. Here they could share their real worries, their small secret hopes. Here sometimes they would even share a joke, a dark, dangerous joke whispered with a hand covering the mouth about Brezhnev's eyebrows or the legendary scarcity of sausage. This quiet, shared laughter was its own small act of rebellion, a tiny spark of defiance in the vast grey machinery. The narrator reflects, "This was the great division of that life. You learned to split yourself in two. There was the public self who sang the songs, marched in the parades, and spoke in the simple declarative sentences of the state. And then there was the private self, the true self, who lived only here in the small warm circle of light at the kitchen table. And trust. Trust was the most valuable and the rarest currency in the entire nation. This table was the only bank where it could be safely exchanged." When the tea was finished, and the last unspoken thoughts had been communicated through a final shared silence, the ritual would end. Nikolai would reach over and turn off the radio. The curtain of static would vanish, and the room would suddenly feel much quieter and much more vulnerable. They would wash their two glasses, and the public silence of the communalka would once again become the law of the land. This was the fear that divided, that atomized, that made you trust only the few tired faces around your small kitchen table. But there was one day a year, one day when another feeling, a much larger and more powerful feeling, washed all of that away. A feeling of shared memory, of collective sorrow and unifying pride that brought everyone together. A day when all the private griefs became one single public story. The kitchen table was a small island of private fear, a place of careful whispers designed to keep the outside world at bay. It was a space that could make a family feel utterly alone. But there was one day a year, one day when another feeling, a much larger and more powerful feeling, washed all of that away. A feeling of shared memory, of collective sorrow and unifying pride that brought everyone together. A day when all the private griefs became one single public story. This was the 9th of May, Victory Day. On this morning, the air itself felt different. The usual grey hum of the city was replaced by a sense of solemn, sacred anticipation. Patriotic music from the Great Patriotic War would play softly from public loudspeakers on the grand avenues, the familiar melancholy melodies drifting through the open windows of every apartment. This was not a day for sleeping in. In their small rooms, Svetlana and Nikolai would prepare not for a celebration but for a ritual. They would put on their best, most respectable clothes, and Nikolai would open a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, were his father's medals. He would take them out one by one and pin them to the lapel of his own coat. He had been too young to fight, but on this day he wore his father's courage. He was not just Nikolai the factory worker, he was the son of a soldier who had defended the motherland. They would take their own young son Sasha and join the great slow-moving river of people flowing toward the city centre. The destination was the parade. The state, of course, loved a parade. And this was the greatest of them all. The ground would begin to tremble long before you saw them, the deep guttural rumble of tanks, their treads chewing at the asphalt, shaking the very foundations of the buildings. The sound was immense, a physical force that you felt in your chest. Then would come the perfectly synchronized tramp of thousands of soldiers' boots, a sound as sharp and final as a closing door. And high overhead, the savage roar of jets tearing across the sky in perfect formation. It was a spectacle of power, a declaration in steel and thunder that they were a nation that had been tested by fire and had endured. Svetlana watched it all, but her eyes, like the eyes of so many others, were not truly on the rockets or the new gleaming tanks. They were searching the crowds, they were looking for the true heart of the day, and there they were, the veterans. They would stand along the parade route or sit on benches in the parks, their old coats too heavy for the May weather pulled tight around their frail shoulders. They were old men and old women, their faces a roadmap of a history that the young could barely imagine. And their chests were a blaze of glory. Heavy with medals and ribbons, a colourful metallic testament to the battles they had survived: Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, the final brutal fight for Berlin. And the people would approach them. It was the day's most sacred tradition. Svetlana would buy a small bouquet of red carnations, the flower of remembrance. She gave one to her son Sasha, his small hand barely able to close around the stem. They saw an old man standing alone, his back ramrod straight, one of his sleeves pinned empty at his side. He had a single magnificent medal on his chest. Sasha was shy. He hid behind his mother's legs, but Svetlana knelt down and whispered to him. "Go on," she said. "Just say thank you. Spasibo." The boy walked forward hesitantly and held out the single crimson flower. The old soldier looked down. His eyes, which had been staring into a distant past, slowly refocused on the small boy in front of him. His face, a mask of stoic memory, seemed to soften, to crumble just a little at the edges. A hand, trembling with age, reached out and took the flower. And for a moment his eyes filled with a light that was not a reflection, but a memory of fire, of loss, and of a profound, unbearable sadness. He simply nodded at the boy, and in that nod an entire generation's story was passed down. This was the real parade. Not the tanks, but this quiet exchange. A river of flowers flowing from the hands of the young to the hands of the old. Later the family would walk to the war memorial. The narrator's voice becomes a deep, soft reflection. 27 million. It is a number so vast it becomes an abstraction, a statistic. But on Victory Day it became a presence, a silence for a generation of ghosts. There was not a single family, not one from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, that had not been touched by that great, terrible fire. Every family had a story. A father who never came home from the front, a mother who starved in a besieged city, a brother lost in the first chaotic retreat. On this day, that private kitchen table grief was allowed to come out into the sun. It was shared. It was understood without a word. And in that sharing, it became something else. It became a source of immense, unbreakable strength. The quiet, isolating fears of their daily lives, the whispers, the mistrust, they all seemed so small in the shadow of this one great unifying memory. This shared past was the bedrock of their world, the foundation of their identity. As dusk began to fall, they would walk home, the solemn music fading, the crowds dispersing. A quiet, contemplative mood would settle over the city. The day was done. The dead had been honoured. The victory had been remembered. That unity forged in the fires of the Great War was the foundation upon which their world was built. It felt solid, eternal, unchanging. But no foundation, not even one sealed in blood and memory, can remain unchanged forever. Slowly, almost imperceptibly after the long hard winter of Stalin's rule, the people of this unbending nation began to feel a change in the air, a quiet, hopeful, and deeply uncertain turning of the season. A thaw. That unity forged in the fires of the Great War was the foundation upon which their world was built. For decades it felt solid, eternal, unchanging, like a great river, frozen in the depths of a Siberian winter. But no foundation, not even one sealed in blood and memory, can remain unchanged forever. A thaw does not begin with a great flood. It begins with a single drop of water from a single icicle. It begins not with a shout, but with a change in the quality of the light, a subtle softening in the air. And so, it was after the long, hard winter of Stalin's rule that the people of this unbending nation began to feel a change. It was a feeling for which they did not yet have a name. It was simply a breath of fresh air. The first sign for Svetlana and Nikolai came not in a newspaper headline or a political speech, but in the darkness of a cinema. For years, films had been heroic fables, stories of cheerful, tireless tractor drivers who were more in love with their machines than with their wives. Stories of brave, one-dimensional soldiers who never knew fear. But one evening they went to see a new film. The title was simple, something like "The Cranes Are Flying," and from the first frame it was different. The story was not about heroes. It was about ordinary people caught in the messy, heartbreaking chaos of the war. The characters were flawed. They made mistakes. They were selfish and they were noble. They felt doubt. They felt regret. And they loved with a desperate human passion. In the flickering darkness of the cinema, a profound collective silence fell over the audience. It was the silence of recognition. These were not symbols on a screen. These were people. When the lights came up, Svetlana saw the faces of the people around her. They were wet with tears. No one spoke. They had been given a small, precious gift, a piece of their own complicated truth reflected back at them. The next sign was even more profound. It came on paper. For years the written word had been a dangerous thing, a world of forbidden poems whispered in secret. But now something impossible happened. Nikolai came home from work one evening, not with a secret, but with a literary journal, a copy of Novi Mir, The New World. He held it with a kind of nervous awe. It was not samizdat passed from hand to hand in the shadows. It was official. You could buy it at a kiosk. And inside it was a story called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. That night they sat at their kitchen table, but the atmosphere was different. The usual curtain of radio static was not needed. The door was still closed, but the fear had changed its shape. It was no longer the fear of being caught, but the shocking, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling of seeing an unspeakable truth printed in black and white for all the world to see. Nikolai read it aloud, his voice low and steady, but with a tremor of disbelief. The story was a simple, brutal, and deeply human account of a single day in a gulag camp. It spoke of the cold, the hunger, the small, desperate strategies for survival, the quiet dignity of a man trying to remain human in a system designed to erase him. It was the great unacknowledged nightmare that had haunted every family, every kitchen table conversation for a generation. And here it was, published, sanctioned. Svetlana listened, and it felt as if a great heavy stone that had been sitting on her chest for her entire life was beginning to dissolve. To name the monster was to rob it of some of its power. The state, the great unbending, infallible state, had for a brief moment admitted that the nightmare was real. This new air began to seep into the streets. The kitchen table conversations, while still cautious, began to change. A joke that was once a dangerous whisper might now be told with a wry smile. A mild critical opinion about a new building, or a shortage in the shops could be voiced without the old familiar knot of fear tightening in your stomach. Svetlana would walk through the parks and see groups of students, their faces alive with a new frantic energy, arguing passionately about poetry, about French films, about art. There was a feeling of intellectual hunger of minds stretching and breathing after being constricted for so long. The narrator reflects, but the thaw was not a simple spring. It was a season of profound contradictions, a confusing dance of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. A book like Solzhenitsyn's was published, but another writer like Pasternak was condemned for his great novel Dr. Zhivago. A truthful film was released, but a director could still be censured. An artist might be celebrated 1 month and declared a public enemy the next. The leader Khrushchev was unpredictable. He was the one who had opened the window, but he was also terrified of what might fly in. The new freedom was not a right. It was a permission that could be revoked at any moment. The hope was real, but it was a nervous, fragile hope, like a young plant pushing its way through the still frozen ground, fearing a late frost. And yet for Svetlana and her generation it was hope nonetheless. It was the feeling that the world was not a solid, unchanging block of ice. It could shift. It could change. The air they breathed was lighter. The future, which had for so long seemed like a straight, predetermined road, now seemed to have a few faint, unexplored paths branching off from it. They did not know where these paths might lead, but for the first time they knew they were there. That small breath of fresh air was a promise, but it was also the first deep, undeniable crack in the ice, and a crack once started will travel. It may take a day or it may take a generation. But eventually, the entire great frozen river begins to move not with a roar, but with a strange, silent surrender. That small breath of fresh air, that hopeful crack in the ice of the great frozen river was a promise. But a crack once started will travel. It may take a day, or it may take a generation. But eventually the entire vast, silent glacier begins to move. It does not break apart with a great thunderous roar. No, it surrenders. It melts from within slowly, quietly, until the world you have always known simply dissolves around you. We find Svetlana now in the last years of the 1980s. She's in her middle age. Her son Sasha is a young man, a student at the university. Her hair has streaks of grey, and the world outside her window is becoming strange, unrecognizable. The hum of the state, that constant low vibration that had been the background music to her entire life, was faltering. It was becoming a discordant, unreliable sound. The first sign was in the shops. The queues returned, but they were different now. They were not the patient social lines of her childhood waiting for a specific known delivery. These were frantic, anxious lines born of a growing panic. The great centralized system was breaking down, and the result was emptiness. Svetlana would walk into the great state-run gastronom, the food store, and find entire aisles completely bare. Rows upon rows of empty shelves, a vast, silent monument to a promise that had finally been broken. It was a strange, quiet kind of apocalypse. Not a landscape of rubble and fire, but of clean, empty shelves and the profound, echoing silence of a world that had run out of things to sell. Then came the new words. Strange foreign words that felt clumsy and alien on the tongue. Glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring, and then later, even stranger words, business, market, democracy. For a generation raised on the simple, solid vocabulary of the collective, This was a confusing new language. It felt as if the very laws of physics were being rewritten. The strangeness seeped into their home through the television. The television had always been a predictable comfort. The news was always good. The harvests were always bountiful. The leaders were always wise. Now when they turned it on, they saw chaos. They saw real shouting arguments in the Congress of People's Deputies. They saw crowds in the streets of distant republics waving unfamiliar flags. And then came the surreal, terrifying days of the August coup in 1991. They watched mesmerized as tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow, not in a proud Victory Day parade, but in a clumsy, failed attempt to turn back time. The perfect curated image of the state was shattering live in their living room. But the moment Svetlana would remember most, the image that truly marked the end of her world, she saw from her own apartment window. It was a grey, overcast afternoon. A crowd had gathered in the square below, but they were mostly silent, just watching. In the centre of the square was a great bronze statue of a revolutionary hero, a man whose stern, unbending face had stared down at the city for as long as she could live. He was a symbol of permanence as solid and eternal as the granite buildings around him. And now there was a crane beside him. A simple industrial crane, its engine emitting a puff of black diesel smoke. Workmen in hard hats had wrapped thick cables around the statue's neck and chest. Svetlana watched her hand pressed against the cold glass of the window. There was no grand music, no political speeches. There was only the mundane industrial sound of the crane's engine groaning with effort, the high-pitched squeal of stressed metal as the cables grew taut. And then slowly, with a final terrible groan, the bronze giant was lifted from its pedestal. It did not crash down. It just hung there, suspended in the grey air, tilted at a pathetic, undignified angle. The symbol that had defined the skyline of her life, the icon of an unshakable system, was now just a heavy, awkward piece of metal, dangling from a rope like a common criminal at the gallows. The feeling that washed over Svetlana was not triumph. It was not joy. It was a profound and unsettling vertigo, the feeling of the world tilting on its axis. The statue was not just a statue. It was a star by which she had navigated her entire life, and now it was gone. What did you follow when the stars fell from the sky? In the days and years that followed, the silence of the fallen statue was replaced by a new chaotic noise. The old certainties were gone. The factory where she had worked for decades now stood silent, its great symphony finished. The price of bread could double overnight. The future, which had always been a straight, predictable road, was now a vast, unmarked wilderness. The narrator reflects. To live through the end of an empire is a strange thing. It happens not in the headlines, but in the small daily recalculations of a life. The cage in a way was gone, but the door had opened into a blizzard, and no one had given them a warmer coat. And so we leave her there. Svetlana, now an old woman, a babushka with kind, weary eyes, stands at her window. The view is different now. The sky above Moscow is lit with the frantic, colourful glow of 1,000 advertisements for products she does not want. The streets below are choked with foreign cars, their horns a new impatient kind of music. Her son Sasha is a man now trying to make his way in this new loud, complicated world. Her world had vanished, and in its place this new one was born. And what was left of that silent, sprawling empire, just this, a story, an echo in the snow, a memory to be shared on a quiet night as a different world, your world, prepares for its own kind of rest. And so we leave her there. Svetlana, now an old woman, a babushka, stands at her window, a silent witness to the end of one world and the chaotic birth of another. The curtain falls on her story, a single quiet life that unfolded in the shadow of a great and terrible idea. We have walked with her through the cramped hallways of the Kommunalka, its air thick with the scent of shared lives. We have stood with her in the patient, frozen silence of the queue, waiting for a loaf of bread that tasted like victory. We have felt the sun on our faces in the secret green freedom of the dacha. We have felt the pride of her red pioneer's scarf and the quiet, dangerous thrill of a forbidden poem read by lamplight. We have been rocked by the lullaby of the Trans-Siberian train and deafened by the great mechanical symphony of the factory. We have sat with her in the fearful quiet of the kitchen table and stood with her in the solemn unifying grief of Victory Day. We have felt the first hopeful breath of the thaw, and we have watched from her window as the very statues of her reality were pulled down. A single life, a universe of experience. The history books will speak of the Cold War, of 5-year plans, of general secretaries and geopolitical strategy. They will show you charts and maps and black and white photographs of men signing treaties. But they will never tell you the most important truth. They will never tell you that history is not a timeline of kings and battles. It is the collected breathing of ordinary people. It is the taste of a hard-won meal. It is the sound of a mother humming a lullaby to a child in a room where the walls are too thin. It is the secret unspoken understanding between two people over a cup of tea. History is a texture. It is a smell. It is a quiet rhythm. Svetlana's story is just one of millions. One quiet, resilient human heart beating its steady, private rhythm against the great, loud, metallic hum of the state. And as you lie here now in the quiet kingdom of your own room, nestled in the safety of your own bed, perhaps you feel the weight of your own world upon your shoulders. The worries of tomorrow, the regrets of yesterday, the small, anxious burdens that we all carry. They can feel as heavy as a sky made of concrete. But as you listen to this story, perhaps you can feel them differently. Your worries, your hopes, your complicated life. They are a part of your own beautiful, finite story. They are a sign that you are living, feeling, choosing. And that freedom, that messy, uncertain, beautiful freedom, it is the very thing a soul from that other time, from that other world might have dreamed of. So now let the story of Svetlana go. Let it dissolve like a photograph fading in the sun. Let the images become soft and distant. The red scarf, the dark bread, the green shoots in the dasha garden, the falling statue. Let them all drift away like snowflakes melting on a warm window pane. Her journey is over, and now so is yours. The only rhythm now is the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Feel it. Inhale the quiet, cool air of your room. And as you exhale, let go of the day. Let go of the need to understand, the need to control. Feel the weight of the blanket that covers you. It is not the weight of a state, but the simple, good, honest weight of comfort. It is here to hold you. It is here to keep you safe. Let the tension in your shoulders dissolve. There are no quotas to meet tonight. Let the tightness in your jaw release. There are no careful words that need to be spoken. Let your mind, which has travelled so far tonight, finally come home to rest in this quiet, peaceful space. The great machine is silent, the hum is gone, and all that is left is the sound of your own quiet. Listen to it. Perhaps you can hear the faint hum of the world outside your own window, the soft whisper of a passing car, the gentle sigh of a house settling in the night. These are the sounds of your own peace. Let them be a lullaby. History is made of these small treasured memories. My story of Svetlana is just one echo. Perhaps your own family has one. A story told about a grandparent, a treasured recipe, a photograph that holds a world within it. If you feel moved to share a small piece of that quiet history, the comments below are a warm and gentle place for it. It is a wonder to see where our shared dreams connect across the globe. A subscription is a quiet promise to meet again in another corner of the past, a lantern lit so the next story may find its way to you. But for now, all that is left to do is rest. Let your thoughts become like the endless birch trees seen from a train window, drifting by without name, without purpose. Let your body grow heavy, sinking deeper into the comfort that holds you. The story is over. The day is done. The journey is complete. Rest now. Rest in this deep and quiet peace. Sleep well.